Hello, my friend, and welcome to day 7 of Painting the Wilderness Seascapes. Today we are embarking toward a mountain lake with a field of wildflowers, with a field of wildflowers, and we're going to build up the layers of the different subjects that we're going to paint. This is one of the more complex composition scenes that we've done so far, and I think that you're going to have fun seeing how we start with one big wet-on-wet layer, and then we slowly build up the details in each of the different sections. It's going to be so much fun, and I can't wait to dive in. I am so excited for the Day 7 project. Today we are going to paint a wildflower meadow in the foreground of a crisp blue lake, mountain lake in like the midground and background. And if you don't know, I'm originally from Utah in the United States, which is filled with mountains and lakes that look just like this. So this reminds me of home. So we are going to get started by taping our paper, and we're going to tape off the top third, because the top third is where we're going to paint the sky and the mountain, and we just kind of want a crisp line between the sky and the mountain and then where the lake starts. So that's the idea of putting the tape right kind of in the paper there. And instead of getting our whole paper wet, I am going to get the sky, just the sky wet, and then the edge of the sky is also going to be the top ridge of the mountain. So we're trying to make the bottom of the sky kind of like, jagged and craggy, because this is a snowy mountain, right? So we're using the white space of the paper to kind of give a base foundation for this mountain. And so it's almost like we're using negative space. Not almost, it is like we're using negative space to kind of, paint the sky and the mountain at the same time. So after I get the sky wet with that kind of jagged bottom, loose bottom, I'm using Prussian blue for the sky, a very light value Prussian blue at first, and then going in with slightly darker value with like loose zigzag strokes that leave behind, little light spaces that just makes it look like, maybe they're kind of wispy clouds or something, just some kind of fun texture for the sky. You could also just do flat blue, that would be fine also. But I kind of wanted to leave the sky just above the mountains a tiny bit lighter than the rest of the sky, just as, a contrast as we kind of paint the mountains. So then I let that sky dry, and now I'm going to start painting the crags and the shadows on the mountain. And instead of starting at the top of the mountain, I'm starting at the bottom with a fairly light value Prussian blue again to just kind of outline. It's almost like I'm painting another mountain layer on top of it, but actually what I'm doing is painting like the shadow on the bottom of the mountain, and that's because this mountain is snowy, right? Though this is, it's just springtime. And so in Utah in springtime, there's often still snow on the mountains. And so in order to not paint too much of the white space away, I'm starting with the darkest parts first, which is the bottom of the mountain, and then just kind of using some loose tendrils to paint really loose strokes up into like the shadows and more crags of the mountain. If you've never painted mountains before, the idea behind painting mountains, especially as you're painting crags and shadows, is that these are very loose, like blobs, pretty much. We're just painting loose, random blobs all over this mountain in kind of really imperfect, choppy strokes. We're just trying to create texture, right? We're just trying to create texture, and we're starting lighter and then moving darker a little bit at a time. And so, I started with that very light value Prussian blue for that base layer of the shadow, and then I gradually used darker paint. And the darker the paint, the less of it I need. And so you see I have lots of white spaces in there, and then just a few kind of random blobs. And if you're thinking, oh, how does she know where to put those? I don't. I'm not putting them in any particular place. I'm just thinking, okay, I need to keep the white space clear, and I need to also paint some shadows. Okay. After that mountain, obviously, I painted just like with Payne's Gray, just a little bit of a mountain layer in front of that snowy mountain, and then I let that whole thing dry. Now we're painting the base layer of the lake. So I took off the tape and I wet the lake with water. And here I'm gonna paint the base layer of the lake and the base layer of the wildflower meadow. So we're starting with some phthalo turquoise and Prussian blue for the lake, just kind of loose, watery strokes, and then adding a little bit of Hooker's green, leaving behind lots of white space. And the reason we're leaving behind lots of white space after that Hooker's green is because in the white spaces, we're going to add the different colors of the wildflowers that we're using. Now, while this is still wet, I'm going to take some salt. I believe this is coarse sea salt that I have, but it doesn't really matter what kind of salt you have. The bigger the salt, the bigger, like, the more space you're going to make. But while this is still wet, I'm just sprinkling some salt on this wet wildflower wash. And the idea is the salt is going to push away the paint, right? I've sped up this process so you can kind of see the paint is being pushed away where the salt is, to make white spaces, to make kind of more of like a delicate kind of texture that I find really fun to use with florals. Spoiler alert, I did kind of cover this up. So, as I paint the florals in the future, I cover it up so that you can't really see the salt effect. And that is one thing that, if I were to change, I probably would go back and try to maintain that salt effect a little bit more, but that's okay. So I let it dry, and then I just kind of wiped away the salt. So there's no salt on it anymore. And now I'm doing the wet on dry layer of the lake. So I'm starting with phthalo turquoise, and I'm basically just doing very wide, loose zigzags of using kind of watery paint, right? So we have that base layer, and right now all I'm doing is adding texture. So I don't want it to be completely flat. I want there to be some white spaces, some dry spaces, because I'm trying to give a general effect of waves. But I'm also not trying to be super realistic necessarily with these waves, right? I'm just trying to add different colors and different textures in that kind of horizontal zigzag kind of shape. So I started with phthalo turquoise, and now I'm adding Prussian blue. And so as I'm adding these colors, these different, values of blue, I am going to try to make a gradient of this. So I want the bottom of the lake to be lighter, and I want the top of the lake to be darker. And that's because when you're painting water, typically, this is not always, but typically, where the lake is deepest, that's where it's going to be the darkest. Or at the very least, like, where it's deeper compared to where you are, as opposed to where it's more shallow, that's where it's going to be lighter. And so the lake, this is called Wildflower Shore, right? Because the lake, the water that's coming right up against the wildflowers is supposed to be like it's coming up onto the shore, even though the way that I'm painting it, the wildflowers are covering the lapping ocean parts. Anyway, so that's the idea. We have this kind of subtle gradient where the bottom of the lake is lighter, top of the lake is darker, and we're just varying between Prussian blue and phthalo turquoise for those wet on dry zigzag layers on top. So I let that dry all the way, and now I'm painting the flowers, and these are super loose. I'm pretty much just painting I don't even know what these flowers are called. I'm sure of course they have a name. But basically I'm just painting loose blobs on either side. They're kind of like the vertical flowers that have little buds on either side of them, right? And so I'm just very loosely painting that kind of shape. And I'm not trying to paint them exactly, right? I'm not trying to add tons of contrast. I'm not trying to add very specific shapes. I'm just painting clusters of these flowers all over. And at some point I stop even trying to paint very specific, the vertical shape of individual flowers. And I kind of just start painting dots just in loose clusters all over. So I kind of create a violet using Quin Rose and Prussian blue, and then I'm just using Quin Rose. Basically, I'm trying to put purple and pink, various colors in here. I even added some white gouache to the purple to make it that kind of pastel purple color, although you can't really see that by the end. And I am intentionally placing these clusters of flowers kind of randomly, but also leaving behind those green spaces, right? Because we are going to paint in greenery in just a little bit. So I'm just kind of going at it, and adding the flowers, I think in total took me about 10 minutes of just kind of slow, deliberate strokes as I was just kind of dotting some flowers. One thing that you can keep in mind that I don't know was like super successful for me, but the flowers that were closest to the shore, meaning farther away from where our perspective is, they are smaller and they are lighter. So if you want to add perspective, if you want to add depth, that is something you could try to do, like to make the flowers more like smaller dots, a little bit further up on the page, which is closer to the water and farther away from you. That's something that you could try. So now I'm taking some Hooker's green, and I am just painting very loose, just kind of pushing the paint around, the green around the flowers in very loose blobs. There's probably a better way to describe that, but I don't have it. So I'm doing the green, just kind of shaping it around the clusters of wildflowers in the foreground, and then also around the edges in the background as, the meadow kind of meets the lake. But I'm making sure that the green is a little bit lighter in the background. I don't know, it's not really background, but the green that's closer to the lake than it is to the foreground. And then the last thing that I'm going to do to add more texture to the green and to make it look like grass, right, is to take some Hooker's green in my small brush and to just make grass, to paint some blades of grass all throughout. Now, as you're painting the wildflowers and the grass, something to keep in mind is, again, nature looks more realistic when you paint things in clusters. And so we're not trying to paint the flowers and the grass evenly necessarily. Trying to keep in mind, like, I'm gonna paint a cluster of grass here and a cluster of grass there. That's going to be very helpful, I think. Okay, now the last thing, this was kind of a spontaneous decision, but because there were just so many horizontal lines, right? Like the line of the mountain and the lines in the waves. And even though the wildflowers themselves are kind of vertical, the block of wildflowers was still kind of horizontal. I wanted to add a little bit of contrast to disrupt that, kind of homogeneity going on. I wanted to add something. And so I decided to add a flock of birds kind of moving up in a diagonal to contrast against all of the lines that we have going on. So whenever I paint birds, I kind of like to give myself an outline first, and then I always paint an odd number. I paint them in clusters, and then I paint them in various shapes and sizes. So sometimes the birds look like just tiny dots, and sometimes I do paint larger wings. When I paint the wings, sometimes I'll paint them in various directions of a V. So like either an upside down V or a right side up V or a sideways V. That's generally what I think about when I paint birds. And so you can see that I didn't do it I painted the birds starting off the left-hand side in kind of a loose zigzag going up into the top of the page. And again, that's because the birds specifically were meant to provide contrast to all of the horizontal lines and layers that we already had going on. And the birds were the last thing. So that's it. I really, really loved this project. I thought it was, it's kind of a simple scene, but it makes me really happy because it just reminds me of bright and cheerful days picnicking up in the mountains. And, there are plenty of lakes that actually look like this, that have, that just look really blue and beautiful and clear. And so this project just made me really happy. I don't know any other way to say it. So in thinking about the things that I loved, thinking about the things that I learned, I I think that I simplified a lot of things. I could have made more waves. I could have made the waves a little bit more choppy. I could have I could have made the wildflowers a little bit more, less blobby and more realistic. I mean, those aren't really things that I loved and learned, but more choices that I could have made. So I'm gonna stick with the prompt. Loved things that I loved. I really, really loved the soft gradient of the lake. I loved how like the bottom of the lake was lighter and then it gradually moved to the top. I actually love finding natural gradients like that in nature. It's one of my very favorite things to pay attention to and to paint. I also really liked, especially after I added the birds, I really liked the movement and the rhythm that I, saw with the various directions and shape of all of the different layers going on. And then I loved how the mountains turned out. I think that the mountains turned out really cool. Just because, they look very snowy. So I think that the starting with the shadow first and then kind of, gradually going up to the top worked out pretty well. So things that I learned, I could have made it because the mountains were in the distance. I probably could have made them more faded and added a little bit more blue, meaning like make them look farther in the distance. I also didn't really use the salt very much, or like I didn't keep the salt effect very much. And I think that, one thing that I learned that I want you to remember too is that when you're painting birds and you're painting flowers, painting them in clusters is a more natural way to paint them. So that was kind of a light bulb moment for me when I was painting landscapes, like paint things in clusters and it looks more real. Thank you for joining me so much today, and I'll see you next time.